Welcome back to the channel, my friends. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and today we're taking a look at 40 years of Warhammer box games through the ages. This video is sponsored by CMO Games. More on that later. Games Workshop has released a great many games over the last 40 years, many dozens of which have been set in the various Warhammer universes. There are far too many to list them all, but to celebrate the Ruby anniversary, we're taking a trip down memory lane for a few of the most momentous. We'll be sticking to games that aren't currently in print, starting of course with the first game to bear the illustrious Warhammer name. So I have been playing Games Workshop games, in particular, almost exclusively for about, a little over 30 years. And I have seen a lot of these games come and go. And while some of them are like nostalgic and were pretty cool along the way, most of these games that are gone probably are gone for a reason. So let's take a look at all of these no longer in print games and see if we see any particular like trends or similarities and see if we can draw any conclusions from that going forward. Alright, so first we have Warhammer Fantasy Battles. First in 1983, then 84 and 87. Look at that OG piece of art right there. Very, very cool. The game that launched it all first appeared in the summer of 1983. That's almost exactly 40 years ago, as 3 black and white volumes in a white box that marked the first appearance of Chaos Warriors smacking a skeleton with a Warhammer. This box contains rules for a mass combat fantasy role-playing game, and while the game was rudimentary compared to the later Warhammer rules, it already offered many of the hallmarks we see today, including bow skill, attack strength, morale, and the redoubtable D6. There were humans, elves, dwarves, goblins, orcs, undead, lizardmen, and chaos, amongst the other familiar staples. These first rules mixed RPG ideas with wargame mechanics, and were quickly updated and condensed into a second edition that kept the bulk of the rules and ironed out most of the inconsistencies. It was then expanded into a third edition that focused on army lists. It would grow into something huge and fabulous, eventually receiving 8 editions and soon a spiritual revival in the form of Warhammer the Old World. So I played fantasy through the ages and it was fun. I think my biggest issue was the lack of support. Literally like months or even years would go by without like any kind of updates or changes or anything from Games Workshop. People complain about current balance and everything, and back then balance was not even a thing. But I think my biggest thing with the Warhammer Fantasy Battles that just really wasn't that cool for me was the whole like rank and flank idea. They did still have some units that use like skirmish movement, but in general, I was just never a huge fan of like the movement trays and the wheeling and all of that different stuff. But I know for a lot of people, it's super nostalgic, and I'm glad that they are bringing back the old world for those people. But I feel like the rest of us have moved on, and Sigmar is overall a better game. And after a few years and a few additions, they've really fleshed out the lore, and I think Sigmar is in a really good place. Alright, next we have Space Hulk, 1989, 1996, 2009, and 2014. So Space Hulk has always been awesome and always one of my favorite games. This right here brings back a little bit of nostalgia just because it was something that I played like when I was super young, and the models at the time were honestly awesome. Terminators, as we've seen this year, little misprint, no surprise from Games Workshop with their lack of editing, are an enduring image of Warhammer. But while these up-armored space marines are found on a wide swathe of battlefields, once upon a time their meteor was more than genestealer-infested confines of the Space Hulk that roamed the galaxy. This was an intense game of exploration in cramped corridors, where your squad could at any moment become swarmed by alien horrors as auspex blips resolved into broods of razor-clawed assault organisms. Tactical dreadnought armor is not quite as tough as you'd like in these conditions. Alright, so here was the next iteration of Space Hulk, which was very cool. The evolution of Space Hulk along the way was honestly awesome, and each edition was just better than the previous. But this was by far the best. I mean, the addition of the awesome new Blood Angel sculpts and the like custom Genestealer sculpts and models, the way the game played just was overall amazing. And if there was one game that I think Games Workshop should bring back, and I know would do well, just not because it's so nostalgic, but just because the actual game was awesome, the models were awesome, just everything about Space Hulk was amazing, I think this is definitely it. So while there have been some rumors over the years of them bringing back Space Hulk, and they did essentially like reprint the game basically as was and offer it for sale, and it sold out extremely quickly and is still popular to this day, I think it's just a matter of time before Games Workshop brings back the best of the best. That's right, Space Hulk. Alright, and then moving right along, we have Mighty Empires, 1990 and 2007. Part strategic overlay for Warhammer Fantasy Battles and part board game in its own right. Mighty Empires might be one of the more unusual Warhammer games. It came with beautiful hexagons, building out entire continents of woods, rivers, mountains, fortresses, cities, and the rest. allowing those who had the space and inclination to play all-consuming campaigns with groups of dedicated friends. There's still something stirring up about the rows of plastic tokens representing entire fleets, armies, and monsters. So I was never a big fan of this one. It reminded me a lot of like Risk with kind of a Warhammer theme, but I've never been a big fan of like the epic, like tiny scale modeling. I actually prefer my models a little bigger because I enjoy like the actual quality of them and the painting and all that stuff. I think games like this, particularly like with the tiny little miniatures, are much more for people that enjoy the actual playing of the game and much less for people that enjoy like the hobby and like the painting and building and all that stuff. All right, and then next we have Space Fleet Battlefleet Gothic, 1991 and then 1999. Battlefleet Gothic is probably the smallest scale miniatures game we've ever produced, reducing mile-long interstellar battleships down to miniatures sitting between just 2 centimeters and 10 centimeters. The combat was similarly colossal, flinging munitions designed to level cities and firing lance batteries with the power to turn continents to glass. The Imperial Space Marines, Imperial Navy, and Adeptus Mechanicus Chaos fleets received the bulk of the miniatures, but orcs, Eldari, Tau, Tyranids, and Necrons all got into the space combat action. Even the Leagues of Votann showed up, technically. They were called Demiurge at the time. So this one has a really big occult following, or at least a really loud one. I never particularly got into Battlefleet Gothic, was never really like jumping out at me. Once again, this was definitely one that was more about the actual game. The spaceship pieces were like pretty cool and the models and everything. But again, the like epic scale, like the gigantic size of the battles and the tiny size of the miniatures is just much more for people that wanted to play the game and a lot less for people that enjoy the actual models. And while I do appreciate the space battles and the epic scale and everything of it, it just never really jumped out at me and never was really that popular in my gaming group. And then Space Fleet, Mighty Spaceships, and Galactic Combat. But BFG was not the first Warhammer game in space. The honor falls to Space Fleet, a spiritual, if not especially mechanical, precursor. Perhaps the oddest things about this version was the 3x3 grid printed on the inside of the box lid, onto which you threw dice to determine whether you hit or missed. So I think we can notice a pretty clear trend so far just from what we've seen. It seems like when they upscale the battles and downscale the miniatures, they don't seem to do particularly well. All right, and the next we have Battle for Armageddon, Horus Heresy, Doom of the Eldar, 1992, 1993, and also 1993. Not every Warhammer game has involved miniatures. In fact, that was a whole wargame series published in the early 90s, which used counters to fight key battles that would come to define lore for decades to come. The first two of these titles are fairly self-explanatory, while the third deals with the Tyranid attack on the craft world of Iyanden. Where else could the Adeptus Arbites, stats 3, 6, 1, rub shoulders with the Emperor himself, times 2, minus x2, minus 3. Okay. So again, we see here, Games Workshop tried to go in on the token route instead of go in on the miniature route and did not do well. All right, and then we have Gorka Morka, 1997. So this one was super cool and pretty popular. It was basically like an orc version of Necromunda. It was definitely fun. It came with a cool starter box set right here with this cool little orc fort. Probably the precursor of like the orc fort and stuff that we saw in Octarius. And a lot of the precursor for what eventually ended up being Necromunda Ash Waste. Gorka Morka is a bit like Necromunda with orcs. It's a ramshackle game of shooters, DACA, and custom jobs with an inspired attitude to rules. Your trucks could carry as many boys as you cared to fit in them. But if any fell off as you moved them, they counted as falling off in the game. The art and style came to redefine everything orky for a new millennia. So this was awesome, and honestly, I thought they were going to bring back Gorka Morka, but they kind of just rolled it back up into Necromunda. Originally, Gorka Morka was supposed to be a Necromunda expansion, and then they actually turned it into its own game. And I think any hopes that Gorka Morka was going to return sort of got washed out with the Ash Waste Necromunda expansion. Now a quick message from today's sponsor. CMO Games has been selling Games Workshop products online for over 20 years. They carry the full line of Games Workshop products, including Warhammer 40,000, Age of Sigmar, Necromunda, Blood Bowl, paint tools, and more. Almost all Games Workshop products are priced at 15% off MSRP. CMO Games takes pre-orders for most Games Workshop products released at their earliest date possible. 12:01 a.m. on Saturday, they go live. Most of these pre-order products are also priced at 15% off MSRP. CMO Games offer free shipping in the US 48 with an order of $50 or more. Their customer service is top-notch and they ship most orders within 24 hours. Visit CMOGames.com using the affiliate link in the description and let them know that you heard about CMO Games from Warhammer Man. Now back to the video. All right, and then we have Warmaster from 2000. Warmaster was an all-too briefly foray into epic scale fantasy, a high-level game of commanding regiments of tiny spearmen, cavalry monsters, and artillery battles. Most of the races in Warhammer Fantasy Battles received at least some miniatures. cast in tiny detailed metal. While there were complete armies for some, even Arabia received a range of miniatures all to its own. So again, we saw basically an epic scale battle game with tiny miniatures, and this had one iteration. It was in, it was out, and it was never popular. So again, we can see a very, very clear trend into what works for Games Workshop and what clearly does not. All right, and then next we have Man of War 1993. As the name suggests, in this game, the races of the old world took to the seas in flotillas of idiocentric ships. But this being Warhammer, these fleets were completely over the top. Spinning size, giant sea beasts, cannons near enough the size of a ship that carried them, and accrued by wizard, demons, and squadrons of flying monsters, with ramming and boarding aplenty. So this is basically like Battlefleet Gothic with the ships, but now we're using boats instead. Once again, it's on an epic scale, which means tiny miniatures, and of course resulted in failure. All right, and then we have Mordheim 1999. So another classic right here. This was sort of like a fantasy version of Necromunda. Mordheim is a historical game of sorts, set 500 or so years before the current date of Warhammer Fantasy Battles, an imperial year 1999, and featured frothing religious fanatics, all scrabbling around for scraps of precious lethal warp stone in the bowels of the destroyed imperial city. Mordheim took all the weirdest parts of the empire to shadowy and screwy extremes, exploring a city gone mad in the wake of an apocalypse. The treasure-hunting warbands included the Sisters of Sigmar, Carnival of Chaos, Witch Hunters, and Skaven of Clan Eshin, with even weirder rosters appearing in the pages of Town Crier, Mordheim's dedicated magazine. So this was a super cool game. It was definitely set up for campaigns. It was cool because your guys would basically like level up and get better. You would recruit new people. It was actually like a really fun game. The terrain was great for the time. I really like the combination of like the plastic and paper stuff. And I think this is one of the games that people still love to this day. And if they brought it back, would probably do okay. But for whatever reason, them kind of like reinventing this as Warcry, while it's still a really cool game and actually one of my favorites, it just never quite hit home the same way. And for some reason, like the thematic element and the like ongoing campaign element of games like Mordheim and Necromunda just haven't transferred over in the same way to like Warcry and some of the other games like Kill Team. Now, I know there's a lot of people out there that do play those campaign leagues, and those are some of the most fun things I have ever played from Games Workshop, or anyone from that matter. There's nothing better than getting new recruits, lasting injuries, capturing and losing territories, and I really like the thematic element of it. They're not always the most balanced, and while they did have some components to help out with that, I think games like this were a lot more about fun and a lot less about being even or competitive, and maybe that's what made them so great. So I think this one goes up near the top of the list with Space Hulk for something that I would love to see them bring back that would probably do pretty well. And to tell you the truth, a lot of the Cities of Sigmar models and everything really remind me of the kind of like grimdark aesthetic of Mordheim and what's so cool about it. All right, and then next we have Inquisitor 2001. The Warhammer Karate's egg to end them all. Inquisitor was a detailed skirmish game set in the 41st millennia, featuring warring factions of the Emperor's Holy Ordos. Two things made it unique. Firstly, it used a D100 system, giving it a true percentage statistic and extreme granularity. Secondly, it was at 54mm scale, twice the size of Warhammer 40,000. A series of incredible models were produced, as well as lashings of exquisitely Baroque lore, and a Space Marine character whose abilities so far outshone any mortal henchman that he would often simply wipe an entire enemy warband off the board in a turn or two, as is fitting. So this was pretty cool. They went the opposite direction with this. We see that they have tried to go with the small scale a bunch of times and it has not worked out well for them. So here they try to go with the large scale. And again, it did have like a big cult following. It was cool and it was fun, but the D100 system is terrible. Now, I enjoy Call of Cthulhu, so I play some games with the D100 system. But the fact of the matter is, in my opinion, just playing on a D20 system makes way more sense. There is plenty of granularity playing with like 5% differences, which is the difference between, a 1 and a 2 or a 19 and a 20 on a D20 versus playing with like 1% differences and using D100s. So while it is cool that they tried something different here, the rule set was just always really clunky. The larger scale miniatures just weren't that cool because it basically meant that you couldn't use anything from your collection, basically like terrain or actual miniatures. And overall, this just sort of felt like another one of the same games, just done worse. But arguably, this is kind of like the precursor to what later would be Kill Team, which again is one of my favorite games. So if it took Inquisitor to get us to Kill Team, I'm okay with it. There have been many more Warhammer games than these over the years, from Dragon Masters in which High Elves fought for Ulthuan, to Tyranid Attack in which band of Space Marine scouts foolishly board a luridly colored hive ship. We could honestly go on forever. If this has interested you, sound off with your own reminiscence of the old classics on Twitter and Facebook. So very cool, a little trip down memory lane. Pretty cool for me, as I have enjoyed most of these games over the years, watched a lot of them come and go. I'm surprised that they didn't put like Epic or Titanicus or something on here, as that was like one of their bigger games, one of their longer running games, and also one that just didn't do all that well. And I think going back, looking over this list, we can see a very clear trend that just does not work for Games Workshop, assuming that, a game no longer existing to this day meant that it wasn't making a ton of money for them, which obviously was the case. And I think the number one factor in all of these was size. We see that every time they try to do these epic battles with tiny little miniatures, the games just didn't do all that well. They didn't last. They didn't succeed. And then even with Inquisitor, where they tried to go the other direction and do the extra big stuff, once again, just didn't do that well. So I think overall, the clearest trend that we can draw from all of this is that when Games Workshop tries to change its scale and go much bigger or much smaller, it never works out for them in the end. Which makes perfect sense, because a lot of people are realizing this now, or have realized it over the last few years, that Games Workshop is definitely a miniature company. That is their top priority, and that's what they do better than anyone else. And the fact that they have been along for so long, even if they have borrowed elements from other games, other lore, universes, etc., they have flushed out like some awesome and amazing lore for their two different universes, but 40K and fantasy. Or AOS, whatever you want to call it. So very cool. Let me know if you had any nostalgic moments with any of these games. If there's any of them you would like to see come back. For me, I think the number one is Space Hulk. I would definitely 100% pick up a copy of Space Hulk and for sure play it again if it was offered in a new variety. And in particular now with the Into the Dark boards and the awesome walls and everything like that, I could 100% see Space Hulk coming back on a whole new level. So let me know which of the old games you would rather see back. I think for a lot of people, it's Warhammer Fantasy, the old world. But the truth is, I think a lot of people remember that game and that universe a lot better than it actually was. And oftentimes when we have something in our memory that we thought was like perfect and great and awesome, once we revisit that and give it a shot again, at least in my experience, I've found that it's never quite the same. And that's why for me, Warhammer Fantasy, the old world, really not getting me all that excited. I'd much rather see a new world on a spaceship with gene stealers and terminators. But that's just me. So special thanks to CMO Games for sponsoring this video. Check them out to save 15% on Games Workshop products. Link in the description. That's it for today. Fun little trip down fantasy lane. Warhammer Man Studios. I'm Warhammer Man, and I'm out of here.